Part 1: A birth of a weapon for survival. The winter of 1941 was not merely cold in the Soviet Union, it was merciless. Snow did not fall gently over the forests and villages west of Moscow, it buried them, swallowed roads, froze rivers into iron highways, and turned the land into a white battlefield where survival itself was a daily struggle. German divisions pushed eastward with terrifying speed, their armored columns grinding through Soviet defenses. Cities burned, villages vanished beneath artillery fire, and the Red Army was forced to fight not only for victory, but for existence. It was in this desperate hour that a weapon emerged, a simple, brutal, and perfectly suited to the unforgiving chaos of the Eastern Front. Its name was the PPSh-41. Unlike the elegant rifles carried by officers or the precision weapons prized by snipers, the PPSh-41 was built with a different philosophy. It was not designed for beauty. It was designed for war in its rawest form. Created by Soviet designer Georgy Shpygin, the weapon was conceived with ruthless practicality in mind. The Soviet Union needed guns that could be produced quickly, cheaply, and in enormous numbers. Factories that once made tractors and agricultural machinery were converted into weapon workshops almost overnight. Skilled engineers worked alongside farmers, students, and factory workers who had never before assembled a firearm. The PPSh-41 was their answer, a weapon made of stamped steel, simple wood, and uncompromising firepower. What made the PPSh-41 truly distinctive was the drum magazine. Holding 71 rounds of 7.62 25mm Tokarev ammunition, it looked almost oversized beneath the compact body of the weapon. But on the battlefield, that massive drum became a symbol of relentless resistance. A soldier armed with the PPSh-41 could unleash a torrent of bullets without pause, filling the frozen air with a deafening roar. At a staggering rate of fire approaching 900 rounds per minute, the weapon sounded less like individual shots and more like a continuous mechanical scream. German soldiers who first encountered it often described the sound as terrifying, like a metallic storm tearing through the forest. Yet the true power of the PPSh-41 was not only in its firepower. It was in its accessibility. This was a weapon for ordinary men. Young recruits barely out of school could learn to use it within minutes. Partisans hiding in the forests could maintain it with basic tools. Even in mud, snow, and freezing temperatures that jammed many other firearms, the PPSh-41 kept firing. In a war defined by extremes, reliability was everything. By the end of 1941, thousands of these submachine guns were already finding their way into the hands of Soviet infantry. They appeared in the trenches outside Moscow, in the ruined streets of Stalingrad, and in the icy forests where Red Army patrols clashed with German units in brutal close-quarters combat. Soldiers quickly learned that the PPSh-41 excelled in these chaotic environments. In narrow streets, dense forests, and shattered buildings, where enemies appeared suddenly at terrifyingly close distances, the weapon's rapid fire could turn the tide of a fight in seconds. It was not long before the silhouette of the PPSh-41, its wooden stock and unmistakable drum magazine, became one of the defining images of the Soviet soldier. Photographs from the front show young men in thick winter coats clutching the weapon with gloved hands, snow clinging to their boots as they advanced through smoke and rubble. In those images, the PPSh-41 is more than a firearm. It is a symbol of defiance, forged in steel and desperation. In a war where survival often depended on seconds and courage was measured in meters gained under fire, the PPSh-41 would become one of the most iconic weapons of the 20th century. But its true story had only just begun. Part 2: The Factory War. Behind every weapon that reaches the battlefield lies another war, one fought not with bullets, but with machines, sweat, and relentless labor. For the Soviet Union during World War II, the factories became front lines of their own. When the German invasion swept deep into Soviet territory in 1941, entire industrial regions were threatened with capture. Rather than allow their factories to fall into enemy hands, Soviet authorities ordered a massive evacuation. Thousands of machines were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and transported east beyond the Ural Mountains. Workers followed, leaving behind homes and families, carrying with them the tools needed to keep the Soviet war machine alive. In these improvised industrial cities, production resumed under unimaginable conditions. Workshops were set up in unfinished buildings, barns, and even open fields. The winter winds cut through broken walls, and the sound of machinery echoed through half-built structures. Workers slept beside the machines they operated, sometimes working shifts that lasted 18 hours or more. Food was scarce. Heating was unreliable. Yet the machines never stopped. Every hour mattered. Every weapon produced could mean another chance for a soldier at the front. The genius of the PPSh-41 lay in how perfectly it suited this industrial struggle. Unlike many firearms of the era, it required relatively little precision machining. Much of the weapon could be manufactured using stamped metal parts rather than labor-intensive milling. This meant factories could produce enormous quantities quickly, even with limited resources. The wooden stock could be shaped with basic woodworking tools, while the metal components could be pressed and assembled in assembly lines that ran day and night. Production numbers quickly climbed into the hundreds of thousands, and then into the millions. By the middle of the war, the PPSh-41 had become one of the most widely produced submachine guns in history. But behind every one of those weapons was a human story of workers who sacrificed comfort, safety, and sometimes their lives to keep production moving. Women formed a large part of the workforce, many of them replacing men who had gone to the front. Teenagers operated lathes and stamping machines with hands still unaccustomed to industrial labor. Engineers improvised new methods of production when materials ran short. Inside these factories, the air smelled of oil, steel dust, and hot metal. Sparks flew from welding torches, illuminating tired faces and determined eyes. The clatter of machines blended with the rhythmic pounding of presses shaping the steel receivers of the PPSh-41. Each finished weapon was inspected quickly, sometimes by workers who knew that the soldier who would carry it might depend on its reliability within days. Despite the harsh conditions, there was a sense of purpose that drove the workers forward. Many had sons, brothers, or husbands fighting on the front lines. The weapons they built would soon travel thousands of kilometers by rail and truck to reach those soldiers. Every drum magazine assembled, every bolt fitted into place, was another contribution to the defense of their homeland. The Soviet war effort depended on this fusion of industry and determination. The PPSh-41 became the embodiment of that effort, a weapon born not only from engineering, but from the collective endurance of millions of people who refused to surrender. Visual prompt. World War II Soviet factory producing PPSh-41 submachine guns, workers assembling weapons on long industrial tables, dramatic interior lighting with sparks from welding machines, nighttime factory illuminated by harsh yellow lamps, women and young workers in Soviet uniforms operating heavy machinery, detailed metal parts and wooden stocks scattered across workbenches, cinematic side camera angles showing assembly line perspective, oil stains and steel dust textures, atmosphere filled with smoke and steam, documentary realism with film grain, ultra-detailed 8K industrial war production scene. Part 3A Fire in the Streets. The true test of the PPSh-41 would come not in factories, but in cities turned into battlefields. Few places demonstrated the weapon's brutal effectiveness more clearly than the ruined streets of Stalingrad. By the summer of 1942, the city on the Volga River had become the focal point of one of the most savage battles in human history. Buildings collapsed under relentless bombing, factories became fortresses, and every street corner turned into contested ground. Soldiers fought for staircases, hallways, and even individual rooms. In this environment, traditional long rifles often became cumbersome. Engagements rarely occurred at long distances. Instead, enemies appeared suddenly around corners or through shattered doorways. In such moments, speed and firepower were everything. This was where the PPSh-41 excelled. Soviet assault units moving through the rubble often carried these submachine guns as their primary weapons. The drum magazine allowed them to maintain sustained fire without constantly reloading. When a squad entered a ruined building, the PPSh-41 could unleash devastating bursts that filled corridors with flying splinters and shattered plaster. The rapid firing sound echoed through the broken walls, a metallic thunder that announced the presence of Soviet troops. German soldiers quickly learned to respect and fear the weapon. Their own standard infantry rifles were accurate and powerful but slower to fire. In the chaos of urban combat, the sheer volume of bullets from a PPSh-41 could overwhelm defenders before they had time to react. Captured examples of the weapon were sometimes used by German troops themselves, a testament to its effectiveness. But behind every firefight was a human story. Imagine a young Soviet soldier advancing through a ruined factory floor, snow drifting through the broken roof. His boots crunch over shattered glass as he grips the wooden stock of his PPSh-41. His heart pounds against his ribs. Somewhere ahead, enemy footsteps echo faintly through the darkness. Suddenly, a burst of gunfire erupts from a doorway. The soldier reacts instinctively, raising the weapon and squeezing the trigger. The PPSh-41 roars to life, the drum magazine feeding round after round as sparks flash in the dim interior. The recoil vibrates through his hands, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. In seconds, the firefight is over. Silence returns, broken only by distant artillery and the crackling of burning debris. For thousands of soldiers, this weapon became a companion in the most terrifying moments of their lives. It was heavy, loud, and sometimes awkward with its large drum magazine, but it offered something invaluably: confidence. Confidence that when the moment came, the weapon would fire. Confidence that in the chaos of battle, it could deliver overwhelming force in the blink of an eye. The streets of Stalingrad were soaked with blood and shattered by relentless violence, but in that crucible of war, the PPSh-41 proved itself as one of the most formidable close combat weapons ever created. Part 4. The sound of the drum. There was a sound on the Eastern Front that many soldiers never forgot. It was not the boom of artillery or the roar of tanks. It was something faster, sharper, more relentless. A furious metallic rhythm that erupted suddenly and poured through the air like a storm of steel. That sound belonged to the PPSh-41. When the trigger was pulled, the weapon did not speak in single shots. It screamed. The high rate of fire transformed each burst into a continuous wave of bullets, the mechanical heartbeat of the weapon echoing through forests, villages, and ruined cities. Soldiers often described it as the sound of a sewing machine running at terrifying speed. Others said it was like tearing cloth made of thunder. The distinctive drum magazine beneath the weapon played a key role in this relentless rhythm. With 71 rounds ready to fire, a soldier could unleash an astonishing volume of ammunition in a matter of seconds. In close-quarters combat, this capacity meant the difference between hesitation and domination. A squad equipped with several PPSh-41s could saturate an entire area with fire, forcing enemies to take cover or retreat. But the drum magazine had its own personality. It was heavy, sometimes difficult to reload quickly, and required careful fitting to ensure reliable feeding. Soldiers learned to treat their magazines almost like personal tools, often preferring specific drums that they knew worked perfectly with their weapon. When properly maintained, however, the system was devastatingly effective. On winter patrols through frozen forests, Soviet soldiers sometimes carried extra drums tucked into their belts or slung in pouches. The metal magazines clinked softly as they moved, each one containing enough ammunition to turn a sudden ambush into a storm of defensive fire. When the battle began, the drum magazine fed the weapon smoothly, round after round disappearing into the chamber as the bolt slammed forward with mechanical precision. The psychological effect of the PPSh-41 was immense. German troops who encountered its rapid bursts often believed they were facing far more enemies than were actually present. The sheer density of fire could create the illusion of overwhelming numbers. In night battles, the muzzle flashes from multiple PPSh-41s looked like chains of sparks tearing through the darkness. Yet for the Soviet soldier holding the weapon, that sound meant survival. It meant that in the terrifying moment when enemy soldiers appeared suddenly from the shadows, there would be no hesitation. The PPSh-41 delivered instant, overwhelming force with the pull of the trigger. Over time, the weapon's sound became woven into the identity of the Red Army itself. In newsreels and wartime propaganda films, the silhouette of the PPSh-41 and the thunder of its rapid fire symbolized Soviet determination. It was the voice of resistance, echoing across battlefields from Leningrad to Berlin. Part 5: A Weapon of the People. By 1943, the PPSh-41 had become far more than a weapon issued to soldiers. It had become the firearm of an entire nation at war. From the frozen trenches of the Northern Front to the burning plains of Ukraine, the unmistakable silhouette of the PPSh-41 appeared in photographs, propaganda posters, and the hands of countless fighters who represented the Soviet war effort. It was carried not only by regular Red Army infantry, but also by partisans hiding deep within forests, tank crews defending their vehicles after being forced to abandon them, and even factory workers who had volunteered for emergency defense units. The weapon's design made this widespread use possible. Its simplicity allowed it to be distributed rapidly across massive armies. Unlike complex firearms that required careful maintenance or specialized training, the PPSh-41 was forgiving. Dirt, snow, and mud could cover its metal surfaces, yet the mechanism often continued to function. In the chaos of war, where weapons were dropped, recovered, and sometimes passed between soldiers, reliability was essential. The PPSh-41 became known for exactly that. For Soviet partisans operating behind German lines, the weapon was especially valuable. These fighters relied on mobility and surprise. They struck quickly, sabotaging supply lines, attacking isolated garrisons, and vanishing back into the forests before enemy reinforcements could arrive. In these sudden clashes, the rapid fire of the PPSh-41 allowed small groups to deliver overwhelming bursts of firepower. A partisan ambush often began with the roar of several PPSh-41s opening fire simultaneously, their drum magazines unleashing torrents of bullets that shattered the stillness of the woods. The weapon also carried symbolic meaning. To many Soviet citizens, the PPSh-41 represented the collective strength of ordinary people. It was not a weapon reserved for elite units or professional soldiers alone. It was the gun of the worker, the farmer, the student who had been thrust into the struggle for survival. Holding it meant becoming part of a larger national effort, a vast human machine determined to resist invasion at any cost. Photographs from the war show soldiers smiling beside their PPSh-41s despite the horrors surrounding them. In muddy trenches, exhausted infantrymen lean against sandbags with the weapon resting across their knees. In liberated villages, partisans pose proudly with drum magazines hanging from their belts. These images capture something deeper than military equipment. They capture identity. The weapon also traveled beyond Soviet borders. As the Red Army pushed westward, thousands of PPSh-41s found their way into the hands of Allied fighters and resistance movements. Its reputation for reliability spread quickly, and even enemy soldiers sometimes used captured versions of the weapon. The PPSh-41 had become a global symbol of wartime resilience. Yet for the men who carried it into battle, it remained a very personal object. Scratches on the wooden stock told the story of long marches and brutal fights. The smell of oil and gunpowder lingered in its metal parts. Each weapon became linked to the survival of the soldier who held it. In a war where millions of lives were lost, the PPSh-41 stood as both a tool of destruction and a shield against annihilation. Part 6a Toward Berlin. As the war turned against Nazi Germany, the Red Army began pushing westward with unstoppable momentum. The battles that followed were among the largest and most destructive in human history. Massive offensives swept across Eastern Europe, and millions of soldiers advanced through devastated landscapes toward the heart of the Third Reich. Throughout this relentless march, the PPSh-41 remained a constant presence. In forests, fields, and shattered cities, Soviet infantry carried the weapon as they closed in on Berlin. Many units had by now replaced the drum magazine with a simpler curved box magazine holding 35 rounds, which made the weapon lighter and easier to handle during long advances. But the identity of the PPSh-41 remained unchanged. Its wooden stock and perforated barrel shroud were instantly recognizable even amid the chaos of battle. By 1945, the weapon had become almost inseparable from the image of the Soviet soldier. War correspondents and photographers captured countless scenes of troops marching westward with PPSh-41s slung over their shoulders. These images showed tired faces hardened by years of war, yet filled with determination. For many of these soldiers, the journey to Berlin represented the culmination of unimaginable sacrifice. In the final battles within the German capital, combat returned to the brutal close-quarters fighting that had defined earlier urban battles. Streets were filled with barricades, shattered vehicles, and burning buildings. Soviet assault troops moved from building to building, clearing rooms and staircases as they advanced. In these confined spaces, the PPSh-41 again proved devastating. Short bursts of automatic fire could dominate narrow hallways and stairwells, forcing defenders back with overwhelming intensity. For the soldiers advancing through Berlin's ruins, every block gained felt like the closing chapter of a long and bloody struggle. Many of them had carried their weapons across thousands of kilometers of battlefield. The same PPSh-41 that had defended Moscow years earlier now echoed through the streets of the enemy's capital. When Soviet troops finally raised their flag above the Reichstag in May 1945, photographs from that moment show soldiers holding PPSh-41s as they celebrated victory. The weapon had traveled with them from the darkest days of invasion to the final triumph over Nazi Germany. It had been present at nearly every stage of the war on the Eastern Front. In those moments of celebration, the PPSh-41 was more than a firearm. It was a witness to history, a silent companion carried through the most brutal conflict of the 20th century. Part 7a Echoes of Steel. Long after the guns of World War II fell silent, the legacy of the PPSh-41 continued to echo through history. Millions of these weapons had been produced during the war, and many remained in service for decades afterward. They appeared in conflicts across Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, carried by soldiers who had never seen the battlefields of Stalingrad or Berlin. Yet the weapon always carried with it the shadow of the war in which it had been born. For historians and collectors today, the PPSh-41 represents more than military engineering. It is a symbol of resilience forged in one of the darkest chapters of human history. Every dent in the metal, every worn mark on the wooden stock, tells a story of a soldier who once depended on it. Imagine one such weapon resting quietly in a museum display case. The drum magazine is empty now. The steel barrel no longer burns with the heat of rapid fire. Visitors walk past slowly, reading the plaque that explains its history. But if one listens closely beyond the silence of the gallery, it is almost possible to hear the echoes of the past. The distant thunder of artillery. The crunch of boots on frozen snow. and the furious mechanical rhythm of a submachine gun that once roared across the battlefields of Europe. The PPSh-41 was never meant to be elegant. It was never designed to be admired. It was built for survival in a world collapsing under war. Yet through that brutal purpose, it became one of the most recognizable weapons ever created. In the hands of ordinary soldiers, it helped defend cities, liberate nations, and shape the outcome of a global conflict. Its story is inseparable from the human struggle that defined the Eastern Front, millions of lives caught between ideology, invasion, and the desperate will to endure. Today, the weapon stands as a reminder of that struggle. Steel, wood, and history fuse together into a symbol that refuses to fade. The PPSh-41 is no longer firing across snowy battlefields, but its legacy remains echoing through time like the fading thunder of a war that reshaped the world.